The car chase is a modern Hollywood staple. But every great thing has to come from somewhere, and every great thing has to evolve over time. So let's chart the history of that evolution. The history of the car chase.
Absolutely not.
There is a saying that the first car race happened after the second car was built. And the first car chase wasn't that far off. The 1903 British short film Runaway Match is 5 minutes long and has just 9 shots. However, it features a husband and bride running away in their car from the bride's father, who is also in a car. Therefore, that makes it the first car film, because the entire film, 5 minutes long, is a car chase. It's not the most climactic car chase by today's standards in any stretch. It's just 2 cars driving down a road. But this is 1903. The car had really only just been invented the decade before. And film had just been invented a few years before. We would have to wait until 1924 when the first vehicle stunt, was made. And who else would do it other than Buster Keaton, the legendary silent film stunt performer / actor. He made a silent comedy called Sherlock Jr., which culminates in a daring rescue of a kidnapped woman, where Keaton rides a bike over railroad tracks, beating a train by inches. And this was made in 1924. There's no green screen or CGI, so how did they do this in camera? Well, they filmed it backwards. It's rather genius, actually. Every vehicle is going in reverse, and then they simply reverse the footage to make it look like forward motion. And that was just one of the stunts, ranging from smashing through signs to driving on the tops of semi-trucks. If you heard a film had a motorcycle drive on top of a semi-truck, you would think it's from Fast and Furious or something. But this is 1924, for crying out loud. But after Buster Keaton's crazy stunts, we wouldn't see any real changes until the 1960s, because the 1960s themselves were full of changes. Cinema was evolving. Gone were the cautionary rules of old, and in were dramatic stories with real bad guys and morally ambiguous heroes. And, at least in our case, technology got a lot better, specifically cameras, with the Reflex 35 II and the Panavision Super 70. The ruggedness and lightness of these cameras allowed a whole new scope of Hollywood filmmaking. Now directors could shoot on location and shoot inside of cars. Previously, films had interior car shots filmed on a studio lot with a moving backdrop. If you've ever watched Dr. No, it is probably one of the most famous examples, if not hilarious examples, of terrible backdrops and actors pretending to drive. Just look at the steering wheel, it's hilarious. But now, with these cameras, you could film in vehicles on location. And 2 movies took full advantage. The first one was John Frankenheimer's 1966 Grand Prix. It was a fictionalized telling of the 1966 F1 season, and it featured real Formula 3 cars driven by real F1 drivers around real F1 tracks. And they're not the low-level drivers that you would think need a payday. I'm talking about drivers like Phil Hill, Graham Hill, Dan Gurney, Juan Manuel Fangio, Jim Clark, Jacques Enrint, and Bruce McLaren all drove for the film, and some of them even had a few speaking lines. It pioneered first-person POV shots to make the audience feel like they were driving a Formula 1 car. So in order to film at speeds required, instead of overcranking, speeding up the footage slightly, they used real cars at real speeds, and the camera cars needed to match it. So they used things like a Ford GT40, a McLaren M2B, a Lotus 25, and an AC Cobra as camera cars, which must be the coolest set of camera cars in the history of filmmaking. They went as far to even incorporate real accidents into the film, because they filmed actual Grand Prix, and if they filmed an accident, they would script those accidents into the film. And when they had accidents already in the script that they had planned for the narrative, They designed one of the world's first car cannons to actually launch the cars without a driver in them. Those cannons, by the way, are still in use today, although a lot more modern and safe and all that. But the film that changed not just car chases, but cinema in general, was Bullitt. It's the one that you all knew was coming as soon as you clicked on this video. The director, Pete Yates, wanted to make a realistic chase in the line of the gritty thriller that he was making. That meant a car chase with real cars flying around San Francisco at high speed. Luckily for Yates, Steve McQueen was cast as Frank Bullitt, and the King of Cool was an avid auto enthusiast. Not only did he later make the 1971 icon Le Mans, which used McQueen's personal Porsche 917, Ferrari 512, Ford GT40, and Porsche 908, which they then actually entered in the 1970 24 Hours of Le Mans, McQueen himself was an acclaimed driver, finishing second overall to 12 Hours of Sebring, racing in the Baja 1000 and the British Touring Car Championship. So McQueen didn't just have the will to make such a high-speed, high-octane scene, he had the talent to drive several of the scenes himself. Granted, some people say he did all the driving, which he didn't. He only did about 10% to be honest, because he had the Tom Cruise problem of insurance not covering if he dies in a stupid car accident for a movie. But you can tell which scenes he did drive by the reflection of the driver in the rearview mirror. And he also pushed for stunt drivers to go faster than Yates initially planned. Yates called for speeds of no more than 80 miles an hour, which is already very fast for city streets in the 1960s. But frequently the cars were pushed past 110 miles an hour. And let's talk about those cars. Frank Bullitt drove a Highland Green Ford Mustang GT, while the baddies he was chasing drove a Dodge Charger RT, and that was a problem. While the Mustang is arguably better looking and certainly more iconic, its 390 cubic inch V8 was over 50 horsepower down on the 440 cubic inch monster in the Charger. That made it very difficult for the cars to stay close to each other during high-speed shots. Therefore, the Mustang got engine upgrades, heavy-duty shocks, and beefier brakes. The Charger also got tougher shocks to survive the multiple jumps during the chase because, yes, with the hilly streets of San Francisco, these cars got airborne a lot. And the editing was also a game changer for cinema. Sure, it's a bit goofy now with the Charger losing 5 hubcaps and the seemingly faster than light Volkswagen Beetle, but in 1968 the use of multiple camera angles spliced together arguably won the film its Oscar for Best Editing. And when it was all said and done, the nearly 11-minute long chase is regarded as the first modern car chase, and is still imitated if rarely replicated today. The use of the Charger was kind of overshadowed by both the Mustang and the Dukes of Hazzard 10 years later, but the Mustang itself is regarded as one of the greatest movie cars of all time, and they only made 2 of them for filmmaking, which is rare. Nowadays you usually make at least 5 or 6 cars, 10 depending on how many stunts you do. They used VIN numbers 558 and 559. They were completely identical, but had dramatically different fates. 558 was the stunt car, had a lot of damage by the end of filming, so it was sent to the scrapyard and seemingly lost to history. Then, a guy named Hugo Sanchez bought a ratty old Mustang GT for an Eleanor project down in Mexico. It was in terrible shape, and that's why he used it for an Eleanor project. But as he was working on it, he began to notice things, like different suspension and brakes than a normal Mustang of the time. Then he checked the VIN number, and sure enough, it was the missing 558 and is currently undergoing a full rebuild. On the other side of the coin, we have 559. It was more of a hero car than the 558, and was spared most of the heavy stunt work, so it survived filming pretty nicely actually, and was sold around for a few years, before ending up in the ownership of the Kieran family in 1974, who proceeded to use it as their daily driver until somebody who knew about the car broke into the garage for some photos. So they hid it from the world in 1980, and it wouldn't be uncovered until 2014. And it was returned to fully operational state in 2016, although, make note, it is not a full restoration. It's got some holes in the frame, and a full restoration would mean a full body-on-frame rebuild, basically, which would ruin the value. And oh boy, does it have some value. At the 2020 Make-Em auctions, it became the most expensive Ford ever sold at auction when it went for $3.7 million. And it'll probably end up in some private collection never to be seen again, which is why the Kearners did a full tour of the car for the Bullet's 50th anniversary and allowed it to be documented for the National Register of Historic Vehicles. Pretty smart. Now that I've talked a lot about Bullet, you'd probably expect me to talk about the other epic car chase that came after. But to be honest, each of them, while great, is just a variant of the Bullet formula. The French Connection basically did the same thing, except it said screw permits, and raced through uncleared streets and crashed into real innocent bystanders, while Gone in 60 Seconds decided to quadruple the length of the Bullet chase to over 40 minutes, and instead of jumping off a little bit of San Francisco's road network, they decided to leap their Mustang 130 feet off of a ramp. But that's as much as I'm going to go into these chases. They're great and they're iconic, but we're actually going to rewind the clocks back to 1964 with James Bond's Goldfinger. Because this was one of the first films to use automobiles for product placement for both the Ford Mustang and the Aston Martin DB5, since both of them were brand spanking new when the film released. In fact, one of the DB5s used for filming was the original prototype since it hadn't really been released yet. Now it's incredibly common and a little bit overused for a brand to make their newest car a star. But it was not as common back then. For example, the Bullet Mustangs were bought at face value for the film, and so were the Minis from the Italian job, despite an offer from Fiat to use the 500s instead. But okay. Literally every single film I have talked about here was made in 1971 or earlier. What about today? In the age of sky-high audience expectations, how do filmmakers deliver? Well, if you're lazy, you use CGI, but even that can have some advantages. Mad Max Fury Road used extensive CGI through its runtime, but instead of being used to make up for shoddy craftsmanship, Mad Max used it to remove tire tracks from previous takes or blend multiple layers of action seamlessly together. And if you want to get actors involved, CGI is actually more complicated and more expensive than other options. Option 1. You get an actor like Tom Cruise or Keanu Reeves who actually does the stunts himself and then just say have at it. Option 2 is the Biscuit. The Biscuit is a vehicle that you put other vehicles on. The actor rides around in the film car, doing all of his acting and whatnot, while the driver of the Biscuit just has to focus on not crashing. This gives a sensation in the backdrop of the actor driving with less risk. Or there's the third option. I call it the Ronin option, because John Frankenheimer, the director of the aforementioned Grand Prix, wanted to film real cars racing through Paris at real speeds with the actors in it. So they hired French Formula One driver Jean-Pierre Gaillard, yep, that's it, to drive the actors through Paris at over 100 miles an hour. And in order to make it look like the actors were driving, they simply bought right-hand drive cars and then fitted a fake steering wheel on the left. Again, a pretty simple, if not very clever, solution. And luckily for audiences, the era of CGI crutches seems to be getting overshadowed by a new wave of practical effects from films like Mad Max, like Mission Impossible, and like Baby Driver, which means the era of spectacular vehicular stunts isn't over yet, despite the Fast and Furious's best efforts.